Alcatraz. This famous landmark in the middle of the San Francisco Bay attracts a variety of visitors every day. It is known as a rock, an island, a prison, and a national park. But few realize that Alcatraz was the site of an event that sparked an entire civil rights movement and would change America forever. In the early centuries after the discovery of America, American Indians were treated as a sovereign nation, but their treaties were often broken by the white settlers. After 1828, government policy toward American Indians changed to removal and relocation. In 1953, the United States passed the new policy of termination, which called for the assimilation of American Indians into American society.
The indigenous struggle for survival in the Western Hemisphere has to deal with like land. It has to do with like the ability to raise our own kids in our own culture, like the right to speak our own language, the right to practice our own religion, to have our own. It's like it all comes down to self-determination.
With this threat to their way of life, American Indians realized something had to be done. On November 20th, 1969, American Indians from various tribes came together to occupy the small deserted island of Alcatraz. Throughout the occupation, the Indians negotiated with the United States government and gained impressive media coverage. Unfortunately, after 18 months, a fire on the island destroyed public support and ended the first step of the American Indian movement. While failing to obtain the occupiers' immediate goals, this brave stand eventually gained for the American Indians what they had sought since 1945, sovereignty of the American Indian nation.
There wasn't any great plan. A group of them met and they were going to go out and occupy the island and make a symbolic statement about the treatment of Indian people. And so they went out there and it claimed it in the name of Indian people. And they recruit students. The occupation, when it first began, was all students. 225 students walked out of their classrooms at UCLA, Berkeley, and San Francisco State and went out there and occupied that island.
It was really on the students themselves. It was really students taking matters into their own hands, saying enough is enough. And we don't like what's going on. The urban Indian community in San Francisco is not being served. There's nothing for our people at the universities. There are no classes in Asian American studies or African American studies or Native American studies. And what is there for us? We deserve a piece of this pie as well.
Though the occupation began with local students, over the 18-month period, 5,600 American Indians from all over the country arrived at Alcatraz to add their support and voice their demands. Calling themselves Indians of all tribes, the occupiers soon drafted the Alcatraz Proclamation, a written declaration of their demands from the U.S. government. The Alcatraz Proclamation, issued a few days after the start of the occupation, declared the former federal prison property of the American Indian people by right of discovery. This notion turned the tables on the white settlers who had previously taken away Indian land on the grounds that they had discovered it. In addition to the property rights to Alcatraz, the occupiers demanded federal funding for an Indian culture center and a center for American Indian studies on the island. This was a direct attack on the recent government policy of termination.
It was a policy that was established that forced Native people to leave their homelands and forced them to find jobs and housing within the cities with the promise that, there'll be opportunities for them. And when they got there, they got to like the slums, they relocated from the reservations to the ghettos. So being at the bottom of the barrel of society, that's what they had to do, is organize themselves, and that's what they did.
While on the island, the American Indians created their own elected council government, a reminder of the days when Indians were a self-governing nation. It was this government that negotiated with Washington, D.C. News of the occupation quickly reached the U.S. government and produced mixed reactions.
If we just give in and give them everything they're asking for, then we look like we lost. And then what kind of precedent does that set for the next group of people? President Nixon had an affinity for American Indian people. His football coach was an American Indian man named Chief Newman, and he kept in contact with Chief Newman and responded to the plight of these people. When the General Services Administration people got the message over the wire, over the telegraph, that the Indians had taken Alcatraz, they said, "We'll have them off in an hour." And President Nixon said, "No, you won't. We're going to listen to them. We're going to see what they have to say, and we're going to negotiate." And that was a revolutionary step for American Indian people to be able to take a stand in the spotlight like that and negotiate with the American government. Hadn't happened for over 100 years.
With tacit government approval, the occupiers soon hit media headlines. Support poured in from all corners.
They sent tremendous amounts of money to the island. They sent food to the island. They sent clothing to the island. They set up a medical center on the island. They set up a little school on the island. So, they were very supportive.
While public support strengthened their cause, the American Indians began negotiating with the government.
They used Coast Guard boats to transport government people out to the island, and they would sit and they'd have coffee and negotiate about, or they would pretend to negotiate. The government wasn't very serious about negotiating.
The occupiers demanded that Alcatraz be returned to the American Indians and that the government fund an Indian Culture Center and university on the island. The government denied their demands and insisted that the American Indians evacuate Alcatraz. Negotiations seemed to be at a standstill. In January 1970, Richard Oakes, the original leader of the occupation, left the island due to a personal tragedy, leaving a radical party in charge. The government cut electricity and water supply from Alcatraz, and the condition of the island deteriorated. Days after the cutting of the water supply, fire broke out on the island and burned historic buildings as well as the famous lighthouse. The government and Indians began throwing blame on each other, and no definite American Indian government could be found to negotiate with. Once plentiful public support seemed to disappear as disorder and confusion spread over Alcatraz. Nixon decided the time had come to end the occupation. On June 10, 1971, police and FBI agents arrived during the day and removed the 15 remaining occupants with little resistance. The American Indian occupation of Alcatraz was over. At first glance, the Alcatraz occupation appeared ineffective and fruitless. After the fire on the island, the once ardent public support for the American Indian cause had quickly diminished. The negotiations with the U.S. government had failed to obtain any of the occupiers' demands. In fact, by the end of the occupation, the government had reverted back to using force to remove the protesters from Alcatraz. Yet, despite these failures, the Indians of all tribes actually made several significant gains through their protest.
The end result, a lot of people say, "Oh, well, they were forced off the island," and "Oh, well, they never got the Indian University." Well, the fact of the matter is that ethnic studies departments are now in colleges and universities across the country, and that wasn't the case before this happened. Also, I think the fact that it didn't end with Alcatraz. It might have felt like a failure because there weren't radical overnight changes, but the occupations continued. There's an occupation at the BIA, there's an occupation of Wounded Knee. The government realized the problem isn't going away. And I think that the determination of the people in the movement is what forced the United States government to pass these things. And Alcatraz was the spark.
They terminated over 100 tribes before the occupation and before they ended that policy. But Nixon ended the policy of termination and instituted the policy of self-determination.
The spark at Alcatraz fueled the growing fire of the American Indian Movement, also known as the AIM, an organization that would continue to fight for Indian rights. While the 1969 American Indian occupation of Alcatraz has been largely underrated in American history, the events and opportunities it created are unforgettable. What happened on this tiny rock in the middle of the San Francisco Bay is deeply imprinted in the memories of those whose lives it changed forever.